Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction as well. Yes, my name is Dr. Paul Thomas. What I'm going to look to do is within the next kind of 30, 40 minutes is just to talk to you about complex adaptive systems and how they apply to leadership in organizations. I'm going to probably leave you with far more questions than I will answers, simply because it's a huge topic, very current, very relevant at the moment. But I'll try my best to get through as much as we possibly can and as quickly as we can. There's a shameless plug for the book, which will give you more depth and more answers if you can get all that through via Amazon. But let's get straight on to it. Over the last 20 years, what I've been doing is trying to work in organizations to get them to think of 21st, and I call it 21st century leadership, and simply for the fact that it's about modern organizations thinking in a modern way, particularly under all the constraints that we'll go through in a moment. But leadership is just simply not about the books. There's so many quotations and different variations on leadership. There's so many different views. You've got sports people, you have politicians, you have academics who all give you a different definition. And what I'm desperately trying to do, certainly in the last 50 years, is get people to understand it's about them. It's about being authentic in the workplace, but also allowing the organization to be authentic, allowing the organization not to act in any way and to be what is suggested in a strategy book or in a management book, but actually to be more about themselves. So that for me is kind of one of the key themes from today. But I want to introduce you very quickly as part of my kind of third theme is this notion of what is complex human systems, what do we do in terms of leading it, can we control it, is it the same as what we've always done but doing something slightly different, and indeed how we get into very quickly how organic sustainable development works in terms of teams and teamship. But I want to start in a sense with really my first real slide, and it's probably my kind of key slide, my last slide in all of this, and this notion of what it is to have great leadership. Fundamentally, it's about trust. Without trust in organizations, you can't take risk. If you can't take risk, you can't be creative and adaptive. But the problem is in organizations and in human systems, what we simply don't know what that is. Trust is something that we feel, something that we get as an instinct rather than something that is real and we can move towards. All I know is working in China, when I kind of studied my doctorate on trust and complex systems, working in China, they have a kind of word for it, guanxi, social trusted network. Around the world, I've picked up on different networks in terms of trust, but fundamentally, trust is something that you either give away, that you have instantly with somebody, and you say, okay, there you are, there's the keys to my Porsche, there's the credit card to my organization, and off you go, or is something that you build up to, and actually they have to prove that they have trust. But it's still something that is fragile, that once you've lost trust in terms of a gesture, a comment, an email, to anybody in the organization, you don't know whether you've lost or not, but when you have, it's incredibly difficult to bring it back. Trust is fundamental. Leadership is about trust. Leadership is about that confidence in the organization, and indeed teamship, this thing called high-performing teams. Without trust, there is no risk-taking. You can't change things, you can't alter things, you can't challenge things, and therefore you're not adapting, you're waiting to be told. 21st century organizations thrive on this notion of actually we have to trust the employees, we have to trust the people around us. In the military terms, they're quite lucky. They break people down over 6 or 7 months and then they rebuild them back up into this core sets of values. We don't have that in organizations. But what we have and what we're suddenly now finding is that really good organizations spend a lot of money on onboarding, inducting the workforce to create that element, not just of the boundaries, not of just the this notion of what the organization is about and what it's trying to achieve, but actually about building up trust. Knowing the people you work for, knowing the people you work with is absolutely critical to this notion of being creative. Now, in that slide, you'll see there's a lot of other words that I've thrown in there because they're the words, they're the buzzwords, they're the words you now see in terms of the current books and the articles that are out there. But for me, it starts on as you look at the left-hand side, this notion of confidence in terms of leadership, but also the health and well-being. One of the things that we've found significant over the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years is this notion, if you look after yourself, you're pretty good at looking after other people. We find people who are working long hours, people who are working in highly stressful positions, people who fail to really kind of take that notion of rest at certain points in the day and in the week and in the months, very rarely come out at the other end, being on the right side of the scale in terms of high performance. So health and well-being, and I will mention it as we go through, is absolutely critical. We work with a number of Olympic athletes, a number of sports stars. What we find is that they work 60 to 70% during the week. And when it really comes to the performance, that real high stressful moment, they give it 100%. The following day, 2 days, they take time off and they back down to 30, 40%. What we found in organizations, CEOs, department leaders, divisional leaders, operational directors, they work at 100% every day. By the time they reach, the end of a working 5-day week, they're absolutely exhausted. And the trouble is, it's very hard to pick up your energy levels over a day or 2 days, particularly if you're then preparing for the following week. So we found health and well-being, confidence, absolutely hand in hand. You'll look at the right-hand side of the slide. We talk about resilience, ownership, pride, engagement, chaos. I'll talk through all of these bits in a moment and throw as much as I possibly can in. But ultimately, you'll see that they're fun. What we again find in high performance, despite the conditions and the workplace or the work purpose, fun is absolutely critical to having a resilient, engaged, and passionate workforce. But all of that fails and pale into insignificance if we have this notion of purpose missing. Again, what we find, and I will go through it in more depth in terms of real high-level performing organizations around the world, they have a clarity in purpose. And it isn't profit. It isn't making more money. It isn't the bottom line. It's actually the top line. It's about the bigger things that we have in life. And certainly working in India a number of years ago, working with Sikh entrepreneurs, their whole purpose of organization was about legacy. What are we actually leaving behind? What's the value added in terms of our organization? Didn't matter where it was, what it was doing, but it was all about that legacy to not just the employees, but to society itself. So that fundamentally is what I'm going to throw into the mix. But it is all based around, and I will keep coming back into this notion of trust, risk, and being creative and being adaptive is absolutely critical for today's 21st century organizations. We asked the question, why? What's changed? Well, certainly over the last kind of 10 or 15 years, we've seen huge paradigm shifts, from, and I won't go into all of this, we don't have time, but this notion of markets moving from this local domestic to this 21st century globally connected organizations. And it's far more now. We still have to look at, and the argument is that we still have to think domestic, we still have to think local. So even if we are a multinational, we are still looking at the local markets and looking at the different cultures and mindsets and different offerings. But we're under attack. We are literally, everything that we do is under a competitive environment from the moment, well, I would say even the moment we go to sleep, we're still under attack. The focus is moving away from profits into customers, and very much what we now find is that we get this notion of value added. What do we add value to? What are we giving to customers? And it's usually by this notion of no exceptions. We are looking at a world of not what is affordable, but people now expect 100% quality, which is extremely difficult in the manufacturing sector to deliver. But it's something that we can't afford to have mistakes. We can't afford to have products or services going out there with some form of defect or just not up to the expectations of our customers. We're moving from mechanical to electronic. We know that everything now is very much IT based and software based, and the internet is kind of taken over. We now even have artificial intelligence, which is certainly in the sector I'm in at the moment, in the banking sector, is starting to present a real challenge for our organizations. But this notion that we move away from capital, real physical buildings and machineries, is now moving to this notion of knowledge. And again, when we're going back into our organizations, it makes it more human, because if we understand that our knowledge, our competitive advantage is leaving at 5 p.m. in the afternoon, and hopefully we'll come back at 9 p.m. the following day, if we treat them right, we have a different view of what our organization in the 21st century looks like. Moving into the people and work, and I've already brushed onto it, this notion of change is constant. Now we're looking at adaptation, we're looking at minute by minute. I think a guy called Tom Peters, a lovely business guru in the 80s and 90s, actually coined it the 1%ers, that when people go into work, really they should be looking at improving their organization by at least 1% every day. By the end of the working week, normally 5 days, we've improved it by 5%. At the end of the month, it's 20%. So we're constantly looking at changing. But therefore, by the very notion of change, we're looking at new ideas, we're looking at creative ways of doing stuff and innovations. But ultimately, again, what comes with that is the negative failures. We are looking at constant small-scale failures, and complex adaptive systems is very much about let's look at failure as a positive. Let's look at it as a way of being, rather than trying to hide a failure until it becomes quite catastrophic in real terms. Small, fast, quick changes, and I think somebody coined it fail fast, fail forward, which is a lovely notion of making small changes, making small mistakes, looking at it, adapting, and moving forward. The idea of task has now become mental ideas. We talk about teamship, not teamwork. Teamship is this very much about diverse personal growth, individuals within the team, but still looking at that core fundamental purpose. What we constantly look at, and what I come across, is groups called teams, but actually they're still groups. The fundamental difference is a shared set of values, a very clear understanding of the purpose, but an honesty, and something I will go into in a minute. That honesty of standing up and making mistakes and doing things differently, but honestly, when somebody doesn't perform well. Diversity, absolutely critical. I think, again, in most organizations, we appoint and elect and bring into the organizations like-minded people. I think great organizations now are starting to say, no, what we want is people that are critical of the way we do things, are able to speak up and speak out of the way we do things. So there's a lot of quirky stuff that's going on, which is really important. But ultimately, it's what we can now do in terms of personal growth and mastery for the employees. It's shifted from that notion of where we bring people in and what they can do for us as a company, to in terms of leadership, what we can constantly do to the employee to make them feel as if they're developing, as if we value them, if we've a notion of loyalty within the organization. But that ability to say, we are allowing you to grow, we're allowing you to move and do different things within the organization, because we benefit from the long term. The final slide in this paradigm shift is this notion of hierarchy. And again, there's a lot of debate now about this. But this notion of we're turning away from top-down, hierarchical, traditional, autocratic organizations to this very flat, democratic type of institution where we simply cannot manage people. Management is 19th century. Management was defined in 1909 by a very esteemed academic on Henry Fayol, who defined it as plan, organize, command, control, and coordinate resources. That is almost impossible to do in the 21st century. This notion of planning is difficult. The notion of organizing is difficult. The organization, indeed, of any type of controlling is virtually impossible. You only have to look at if you have children. Do you control children? Most of the answers you get is no. What you try to do with children is to influence, is to inculcate a set of values and belief systems that take them forward in the right way, a set of boundaries that's important. But ultimately, organizations that are top-down and hierarchical with one brain thinking at the top of an organization is pretty limited. In all of the organizations we work with, whether it's 5 people, whether it's 58,000 people, what we have is 5 brains and 58,000 brains working in order to think, to adapt, to create the new, and to drive different things. If we have one brain, we're struggling. If there's a notion of a manager or a CEO out there who thinks he or she's more intelligent than 5 people, they're sadly mistaken, let alone 48 or 58,000 people. So this notion that democracy doesn't come without its pain, without its difficulties. In networks, it's difficult because you're suddenly losing this idea of what works and how to plan it out, how to draw it. That, unfortunately, is 21st century. That, unfortunately, is what we're really dealing with. The top-down hierarchical lovely systematic, lovely drawn out flow diagram of a network is what we call formal structure. It doesn't represent what is actually going on in the organization, which we now call shadow system. And it's the shadow system that has the greatest impact in the organization itself. Why were we talking complexity? It's certainly 10, 15 years ago. I would not have done certainly a public seminar on complexity. It would have been very difficult to even get a business audience in the room. Things have changed dramatically because complexity is now seen as the real laws of human systems, how we actually work, rather than this old-fashioned traditional reductionist mindset. And that we're now looking at this wonderful mixture of human beings and self-organizing and co-evolution, this notion that actually we're not in control, we're actually just along for the ride. A number of organizations have changed it, but really, in a sense, the biggest problems, and I've listed some of them from the Harvard Business Review, is this notion of Uber and Get and not-for-profits and big box stores. I mean, you only look at Uber and Get, they are taxi companies that don't actually own any taxis. You've got, not-for-profits, organizations that are now suddenly springing up, taking the business away because people want to buy into these non-profits because it's tribal. It's part of a belief system. It's part of something much bigger than just simply it's another corporation. But they're making huge difference in inroads. You have Amazon, another wonderful example of an online retail shop company that doesn't actually own, in the true sense of the word, a shop or any products or stores, anything. It leaves it all to its clients. So this notion of going through, and I won't go again, I don't have time to go through all of them, but this notion of cost cutting to maintain a competitive advantage is no longer relevant. It's important, but an organization that drives efficiencies doesn't become effective. The really successful human systems are effective first and efficient second. And again, I will go into that in a little bit more depth. But working with clients that sometimes don't value work because they'll see things on the internet that's a lot cheaper, that's a lot quicker, that's a lot faster. So you constantly have to move forward a lot more. But certainly this notion of being paid fairly for your work is extremely difficult. Paying and keeping great team members, it's extremely difficult. There's always somebody that will pay more or offer more. The idea now in human systems, and certainly the systems that we work with, it's actually about added value. There's a gym there, there's a health and well-being clinic, there's lovely sweets and cakes on a Friday, there's a football team and a squash team in the evenings. All of this stuff is this added bonus to make the workplace more like home, more like a normal natural system than a workplace. But the economy itself, we know with all the kind of things that's going on around the world, it's becoming incredibly difficult to even predict 6 months ahead, let alone 1 year to 5 months. So what am I talking about? Well, very quickly, I'll get into this notion of what is complexity. I've named it simplexity, and I kind of named it simplexity a number of years ago. Why? Because complexity sounded really complex. So what I wanted to desperately do is to say, well, actually, complexity is about making the complicated simple. And I put the simplexity in as part of that architecture. What you'll see on the left-hand side is where it comes from. This isn't a business theory. It isn't something that's just happened. This is 1909, 1905 in terms of mathematics. But it very much comes from the hard sciences, from chemistry and physics, biology, and even down to social sciences. But somebody like Ilya Prigogine, who's a Nobel Prize winner in 1999, actually said that we've done all the nice, easy things in science and in human systems. What's left is the difficult stuff, is the soft stuff, is the complex interaction that happens when human beings connect. And he was quite right. What we've now left is this world of where self-organization happens, where people actually work things out themselves and try and bend and move around and manipulate rules. What you have always when you connect people face to face is this notion of emergence, of connectivity, interdependence, and feedback. That very quickly, very simply, is when you stop emailing somebody and you actually go and speak to somebody, what you have is a set of principles, which is very basic, very human, and that's an emergence. So you see people, you talk to people, and as long as you're able to connect, actually have a conversation, what happens is there's a constant and immediate feedback. And during that feedback session, what we have is this notion of interdependence, this notion of actually you work, we work together, and things happen quite wonderfully. It's something that's unpredictable. It's something that we see in business schools, and when we teach, is the light bulb moments go on, you see the eyes light up, or the opposite. In fact, you see what we call a 1,000-yard stare, where they're looking at you, but they're thinking of a shopping list, they're thinking of what's happening tomorrow, they're thinking of that, your lips are moving, there's sound coming out of your mouth, but ultimately there's not a lot actually sinking in. When you meet people, and I've always said the problem with all of this is the email electronic systems that we use. As soon as we start communicating through emails, we lose emergence, we lose connectivity, we lose that real feedback, because we lose things through this notion of a medium which is very sterile. So we, again, part of the change that we normally put into organizations, we stop people from emailing. It's quite bizarre to watch behaviors. But as soon as we say you cannot email people, in fact, if you do email people, you'll see you have to pay £10. You have to pay 20 euros. You have to pay $20 every time you send an email. And by the way, that $20 will go to a charity. What you have is an incredible change in behavior. Not to begin with, people will pay out the money, but initially what they'll start to do, instead of sending an email, is to Skype, or to talk to them, or to actually go and sit down and have a cup of tea, a cup of coffee with them, and talk through issues. Now, if you're running an organization which is 48,000 people, or 58 as we're currently in, 58,000 people, it's almost simple. How on earth do you connect with 58,000 people? Well, simple answer is you don't. And you don't connect with them via email either. It's not a substitute for actually getting out and what we call infecting people with your passion, with your clarity of purpose. That really is complex human systems 101. It's the real basic stuff. But when you get into all of this, once you start connecting with people, once you start actually doing face-to-face, you start talking about clarity, what you get is you allow people to move away from the equilibrium, safety, stability. Once you move away from equilibrium, stability and safety, and you start to innovate, you start to challenge, you start to see things differently, that's when you start to create the new organization. That's when you need trust. That's when you start to see real changes in real time happening, not with permission, but with almost collaboration. And that's a vital change and difference. You also get this thing called co-evolution. As soon as you start to talk to people, as soon as you start to co-evolve, as soon as you start to take risks, you'll start to pick up and see how things change and how things move forward. I want to show you this very quickly. It's this notion. This is a picture. It looks a very confused picture, but this is a picture of a conversation from a number of CEOs in a room. And in our sessions, what we have is an artist that stands behind them and talks through what this looks like, and will simply paint and draw their conversation. And this is their conversation. And I will give you a minute to look at it, because it's really important. This is the conversation of a number, I would say 22 CEOs from very large multinational companies. And the one question I asked them was, what are you certain about? What are you in control of? And this is their conversation. You'll see the conversation is mapped out in this wonderful picture. If you're looking at it and wondering where the CEOs are and the directors are, you'll see that they're at the top of that turret, that castle. One is looking out in terms of future strategy. One is looking behind in terms of resources and analyzing. And then you'll see the white flag. They're almost surrendering, saying, well, actually, we know this isn't right. We know this is wrong. But this drive towards targets and overheads and costs and incentives are all this common language, which isn't human and which isn't complex. What it is actually driving the organization into this very top-down hierarchical type of organization, which is looking at bits rather than looking at the whole. And what you also then see is that the resources, the people, are outside the organization pushing it. So they weren't even considered to be part of the organization. I could do this probably in most senior positions, most organizations, and get the same type of conversation. And that's quite awful. We know, and we have known in for example, manufacturing, that the targets sub-optimize human systems. They lower performance. As soon as you set a target of 15, what you have is a sub-optimization. People will either work to 15, which is rare, because if you work to 15, I will, as manager, up it to 16. So people very quickly understand that actually what they need to do is 14. So I've instantly sub-optimized my system. And this is very general. This is a very silly example. But it's worked throughout the manufacturing industries, and it certainly works in terms of high performance. We never set a target. We get the staff, the organization, the people, the teams themselves to set targets. But again, we're trying to steer away from it because it's about adding value. It's about the good stuff, the working in teams, rather than just simply setting targets. We know it's wrong when the executives certainly know it's wrong because it's on square wheels. They built this organization knowing it's a really difficult thing to push forward. Why? It's cumbersome, it's slow, because there's one brain, there's one person in charge, there's top-down, it's hierarchical, it's looking at the wrong things, it's quite selfish in the way it looks at stuff. Whereas if you actually engage people in flat structures, what you have is everybody looking around and doing some wonderful stuff. When you start to really engage and look at complexity, what you start to get is this type of results. This is generic. This is, certainly over the last 20 years, we've got hundreds of these things. Increased quality. One organization was up by 30%, morale up 30%, higher in terms of service level agreements, in terms of public services, up 23%. Ideas for improvement. This was on a daily rate, so we were going from almost zero in terms of ideas to 60% increase. It was incredible the amount of ideas that were coming through. But what I also see quite often is a lowering of staff turnover. People don't want to leave the organization because they actually get back into this notion of actually I'm adding value, I'm part of this trusting environment. Sickness decreased. But you'll see the great one for me is increasing productivity. I've never seen productivity increased in manufacturing company 300% by using a particular method or tool. And you have to remember, this isn't a method or tool, this is a perspective. This is actually looking at people and saying, what do we do and how do we do it? One of the fundamental questions I always ask, I'm conscious of the time, is this notion of why should people be led by you? It's a lovely question. It's a coaching test question. It's critical if you lead a team. It's even bigger if you lead an organization. If it's because it's your organization, if it's because you're the boss, if it's because, well, actually I'm most experienced, well, actually they pay me the most, then unfortunately I think you're in the wrong job. People should be led by you because you empower them. People want to be led by you because they're there waiting, because they find you passionate about the organization, they're passionate about the service that you deliver. And that's very difficult if you try and act like a CEO or like a manager. So it's absolutely critical. Fundamental, it's certainly one of the questions that we ask, and one of the things that perhaps you should think about as the day goes on, as the week goes on. But one of the things, and you probably all have come across this thing called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It is complexity in a kind of nutshell, that the world is going through and incredible changes as we've seen. There's a level of uncertainty that we've never seen before. And people know there's a level of uncertainty. Ilya Prigogine, as I mentioned earlier, says that we're now in the age of uncertainty, not certainty. We're talking about complex issues. There's no single solutions. We have a wonderful knack of dealing with the symptoms of something, and we fail to get back to the actual cause of something. So when we have a high level of sickness and absenteeism, we do this wonderful stuff of back to work, we interview people, we send them off to doctors. What we fail to do is to really fully understand why they're off sick in the first place. And we find there's a number of causes. No, there's not one single solution to it. But that's really difficult. It's really messy. But that's what, again, 21st century talks about. But this notion of ambiguous, really hazy, lots of mysteries. We're desperately looking at big data as the savior of all things. It's not going to happen. As soon as we start to get data and figures, it becomes even more difficult because we get this unconscious bias towards things, and this is where the diversity comes in place. This is where real leadership takes place, because you have to stand there, stand firm, and say, "I don't know. I don't understand what's actually happening." There might be an inkling, but the idea is not to stand there, but allow the team to do this so they can adapt and co-evolve. One of the things I come across, and I threw this in just to kind of break the momentum slightly, but the kind of notion of 5-year-olds. Every organization I go into, we get a notion of the 5-year-olds, the people who have determined to resist change. And it was lovely in China. They actually termed them and deemed them as smiling tigers. And I've always used that saying since, because you come across people who say, this is great, this is wonderful. Now, yes, I'm definitely going to lead my organization. I'm going to engage everybody. I'm going to empower everybody. I'm going to make sure that their health and well-being is structured. But then they go, wait again, nah, not for me. Actually, I'll just allow it to go the way it's always gone, because, well, that's the way I was treated. So therefore, I'll allow it to be that way. So the duplicitous, the lack of integrity in some people is quite stark. And over the last 12 months, certainly, I've seen that at board level, and I've seen it at the CEO level. That has a massive impact on the organization. Because once people see the 5-year-olds, once people see that they're not approachable, or they're just simply not passionate, they're more interested in controlling than leading. And you have to remember that leadership is about giving away power and creating more leaders. The old-fashioned way was always about taking control and creating followers. That's not 21st century. 21st century, create more leaders. If you've got 10 people in an organization, you need 10 leaders. As soon as you start to revert back to the 5-year-old, and keep that picture in mind, because it's not your idea, or it's not what you wanted to do, or it's not how you wanted to do it, then you're already starting to revert back into the old-fashioned type of organization. There's a really strange, and I've done this, just as, again, simple ask, true or false, success is more about luck than actual planning, because there's a lot of people out there that think that they can plan their way through, they can create success by planning and spend more time in planning than they do in actually doing things. I think there's a healthy balance. I think you have to plan, and planning used to be, in my day, 10, 20, 30 years ago, fun. It used to be enjoyable. What it used to do is to bring us together as a group of people rather than just simply plan out the future. But what it did do is allow us to talk to each individual. What it allowed us to do is to communicate what we thought the future looked like, and that was critical to the organization. I talk about the, I hope I'm not going too fast, and I do apologize if I am. I'm desperately trying to get through some of the key slides. What we look at in organizations is this informal and formal structures. You look on the right, you see the formal structure. That's a lovely CEO, directors, deputy directors, and assistant directors, and you've got this wonderful pyramid-shaped organization. The reality is that you're actually dealing on the left-hand side, which is this notion of complex adaptive networks. If you look at that network and you think, how do I influence it? How do I get in there? How do I change it? You're now starting to realize the amount of mess we bring into organizations. And the mess is individuals. Human mess is particularly difficult to manage. We pretend, we put people in nice little boxes and office and structures, but that's not how they operate. What you're looking at in terms of the network diagram is what we call shadow systems. What you have to do with shadow systems is lead, is to influence, is to co-evolve, is to get in and talk and ask questions. What you don't do is start to move around the deck chairs on the right-hand side in terms of formal structures. Moving chairs around, moving desks around, moving offices around will not alter your shadow system. All it will do is slow it up and damage it slightly. And it's really strange, because the notion of power comes mostly from titles. Successful organizations, really great organizations, now move away from titles, and that we're all just simply an officer of Paul Thomas's organization. And our job is to serve the customer, or to add value, or to provide a service. It is not, about head of, chief of, director of. It's absolutely about what are we adding value. And changing titles is a very subtle way of getting people to change the way they operate. So just a quick reflection on great leadership. It is about dealing with the mess of human systems, the complex architecture, about allowing the people to come in and go when they want to, allowing this emergent connectivity, allowing them to create the interdependence, from the person who makes the tea in the morning to the person who delivers that financial spreadsheet. They have to see a level of independence. The only way you do that is by getting people to talk to each other. This notion of feedback is in all systems. Now, feedback can be deemed negative, so we've actually coined the term feed forward, the notion that we feed forward. So if we play a sport today and we make a mistake, and we make errors, we drop the ball, we miss tackles, we do things that are wrong, what we don't do is concentrate on what we did wrong at that particular moment in time. What we now do is look tomorrow and say, okay, what will we do differently? How will we run harder? How will we pass the ball better? How do we, in our organization, make sure that that customer isn't dissatisfied, or we don't make the same mistake in terms of the spreadsheet again. So feed forward is vital because it's a positive way of looking at change, and people are far more open towards that notion and become far resilient in that sense because they gain confidence. So it isn't about the negativity of failure, it's actually about what did we learn, what will we do differently in order to move things forward. So it's absolutely, again, critical, vital, and very simplistic, but we very rarely see it in low-performing organizations. This notion of co-evolution is again critical, and I will just spend a few seconds on it, because co-evolution, when you start to talk to people, they also impact back on you. So there's a managing director that is probably a year, 2, 3 years outside. If you sit with frontline staff or deliver with frontline staff, even if it's just for an hour or for a day, what you start to pick up on is what it's really like to be there. And you forget over time what it was like to be in the front line. So it's incredibly important that you are there. I will leave slightly in terms of the boundaries. This boundary diagram is particularly important. It's from NASA. It's modified, and I've used it in all sorts of wrong places. But for me, having the 3 boundaries is critical. When as a leader, as a director, and in order for your organization to be resilient, there are 3 things that are immovable in your organization. They cannot alter. They can move in, but they can't move out. It's usually economic, it's usually quality, and it's usually performance. If you concentrate on economic, if you can concentrate constantly on money efficiencies, what happens is that everybody will stick to that boundary. What they'll then forget and lose is the notion of performance and the notion of quality. The quality decreases if you concentrate on one boundary. The quality will decrease if you just concentrate on performance. So if you try to push performance, your quality will instantly go down. If you stick on quality, and you say, right, it's 100% quality, your costs will shoot up, and you'll very quickly go over budget, and your performance will decrease as a result of it. So it's very simplistic, but what we try to do is desperately find different types of boundaries and that are unique to your organization. I put some really silly ones up there, but one big pharmaceutical company, global company, actually had increase income, decrease expenditure, and have fun as their boundaries. Because if they weren't having fun, they wouldn't achieve their income levels, and they certainly wouldn't decrease their expenditure levels. But it worked. It worked because it was part of their organization, and they didn't look outside for the Spotifys of the world and the Amazons and the Apples of the world. They actually looked at the people inside and said, what are our immovables? What are the things that we come into work that we want to do, that we want to be free to do? Because in the middle of those boundaries, we work. That's where we kind of reside as an organization, where it's one person of 58,000 people or 108,000 people in this organization. But ultimately, those boundaries are immovable. You can bring them in, you can save money, you can increase income or decrease income, but you've got to explain. You've got to then stand up and say, okay, I've done it for these reasons. So they're wonderful, simplistic indicators for great leadership. But ultimately, they're absolutely critical for the organization to survive. Because if you start breaking them, really bad things happen. And if you concentrate on profit, if you concentrate on economic issues, you lose the purpose motive. And the purpose motive in the 21st century is absolutely 100% the indicator for great success. And just aside, it's a wonderful story that when we work with British Lions and rugby players, what we never do is to say, well, when you go on that pitch, it's about winning. They know it's about winning. When you don't play, you're not an athlete or a sports person to be high performing, to go on there and lose. So that's a given. What we go on there and say, okay, what are you going to do when you get on the pitch? What are you going to do when you get out on that track, or when you're going to get into that squash court? And fundamentally, it is about, well, making sure my shots are right, and I'm going to have some fun. The question we ask when our players come off is, it's always, did you have fun? When you went to that really difficult financial meeting, you come out of it, how do you feel? Well, I feel okay. Did you have fun? Yes. Well, that's all it's about. Because if you have fun, it's probably pretty spot on, and you've got it right. So hopefully that will give you some ideas of how and what next. But I will stop with this, because this is really, in a sense, the wonderful thing is, what will you stop doing tomorrow to help increase performance? Because a lot of organizations layer upon layer upon layer, but what next? What more can we do in organizations? What forms do we fill in? What meetings do we go to in order to increase performance? But actually, in reflection, it's about stepping back. It's about stopping and looking at the organization and saying, okay, How do I build up more leaders? Let's put them into the meetings. How do I build up more confidence? Let's start having one-to-ones more often. Let's actually, you know, sitting down and looking at my staff and dealing them as human beings, not as employees or as assistant directors. But how do I stop, what do I stop doing, sorry, is absolutely critical, because it goes back in that simple notion of what are we doing, why are we doing it, and how can we change it? Fundamental what, why, and how. What are we doing? Is it adding value? Is it the right thing? Start to ask the questions, why are we doing it? Is it really what we do as an organization? Is how we operate as an organization? And then if the answer is yes, well, how are we doing it? So that's really critically important. To summarize, I think I'm just about over time. You know, the leader must focus on openness. The more transparent you are, and again, I've put some links to the end of this in terms of some of the videos that's online. There's a wonderful video on monkeys that if you're not open and transparent, you start to kind of reap the reward of that in terms of negativity very quickly. Move from feedback to feed forward, so you drive organizations. Start looking at co-evolution. Start looking at face-to-face rather than electronics or formal meetings. Actually start to have some fun informal meetings, but add value and make leaders add value. But this notion of trust is absolutely critical. We've got to look at motivation, not from the fact that money doesn't matter. It does, of course, but it's about motivation in terms of adding value to loyalty, working with a group of people that actually have similar values and that you like. But democracy is incredibly powerful. Once they take a democratic decision, they own that decision. When they own that decision, there's almost a drive to actually make it work. So they will learn by mistakes. And because if it's the wrong decision, they'll very quickly make it the right decision. The transfer of knowledge within that is incredibly powerful and actually critical to the organization. Lovely. That's neat then. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, for a very, very intriguing presentation. Folks, we are now open for question and answers. So if you have any questions, you could either insert it in the question box, or you could equally raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the console, so please click on it if you would like to speak to Dr. Thomas. But let me go to the question box. There are a couple of questions posted already. First one, Doctor, why is simplicity better than management?
It's incredibly. It's the law of the game. I mean, you know, management is something now we should do in front line. Management is now something that we push down, and we call them self-managed teams. It's a skill, it's a way of thinking, but it's 19th century. What we've got to do now is get into the 21st century, and complexity, this notion of dealing with complex, messy systems. You cannot manage mess. So stop doing it. It doesn't work for the people in the organization, and it's certainly unhelpful and painful for the people who are trying desperately to manage. So it's a really simple notion that let's learn the game that we're in. The game we're in is about human beings. The game we're in is about natural human systems, which follow different laws, different rules. So the more leadership and more simplistic we become in terms of what we do, the better our organization will be.
Okay, thank you very much. Another one. How can companies start to embrace leadership and frontline change?
I think that's brilliant. I think to begin with, I think it's about, and there's lots of different techniques you can go to, but the notion for me is about simply stop managing, stop telling people what to do and when to do it. Start asking questions. So instead of them saying to you, I want to give me permission to do this, you start asking why. In a very nice way, go, why are we doing it? You know, what are we doing? And allowing them to come up with the decisions. They very quickly realize there's no point in asking for permission any longer. What they've got to do is to inform you of why they're doing something. So those subtle psychological changes in the staff very quickly will start to change the notion of the organization. But you really do have to start questioning the value added of what you're doing, and look at your schedule. Look at your schedule today for the next week and see what are you doing, because that's where you're focusing your energy and your your time on. And if it is meetings, if it is formal, if it is sitting there listening to somebody, talk through a spreadsheet and then, look around the room for a decision that isn't made because it goes into another committee and another committee, then what you start to do is realize that you're doing the wrong things. The change begins firstly with you, your behaviors. It doesn't have to be what you say, but your behaviors. So you start changing the way you behave, start actually going to frontline, start supporting, start meeting different people face to face, stop emailing, for example, and only email when it's actually critical and vital. Remove CC and BCC in your inboxes, which again, a lot of organizations have done. A lot of organizations have stopped doing internal emails. And I'm desperately not focusing on emails because it has a place, but it's not the be all and end all in terms of actually organizations and being successful. Small little changes very quickly at speed will grow momentum into a very high level trusted organization. And when somebody makes a mistake, don't pull them out. Feed forward. Talk to them about what can we do differently so it doesn't happen again. Don't take them down the disciplinary route. Hope that helps.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And another one. Can all people change to this way of thinking?
That's a really simple one because I think the answer is no. I think I would love to have said, 20 years ago that absolutely, because we're all human beings and therefore we can all think in a human, because we all live in a family, which is the first complex system that we ever kind of experience, where sometimes the mother's in charge, the grandparents are in charge, and tomorrow the children are in charge. There's this flowing, democratic, messy type of organization with different people in charge all the time, but there's a core set of values. But ultimately, the more organizations that I've worked in, I come across the smiling tigers. I come across the people who find it incredibly difficult to move away from a top-down hierarchical control persona to a very free-thinking, agile, leadership-driven type of organization. Why? Because you've got to give away control. Why? Because you've got to give away power in order to get power back. And to create more leaders, sometimes that's threatening for a lot of individuals. But I'm seeing more and more of the millennial, the youngsters coming through that won't put up with a top-down, control-oriented individual. What they're looking for is somebody who will support them. They're looking for that teacher, that coach. So the whole role needs to be changed. Some people get it. Some people like human beings. Some people like spreadsheets. People like spreadsheets and numbers and data and machines. I'm not particularly excited about human beings. Perhaps leadership isn't for them. There's something else out there for them to do. But people are not machines, and certainly not spreadsheets and numbers. And the more leaders we actually get in place, the better our organizations will be. So the simple answer is no. I'd love to have thought 20 years ago, particularly head of leadership, that I can train everybody to be and develop everybody to be leaders. But the more I do it, the more I realize that some people just don't get it. And if they act like a leader, again, people will see through it. They'll see it as an act. It's very painful for them and incredibly painful for the people who are seeing through the act.
Okay, thank you very much. And another one. Normally, simplicity is misunderstood with the slow cultural organizations. How would you want us to differentiate it?
In slow organizations, what do you mean? Bureaucratic, high level? Is that what you mean? The slow
Yes.
organizations, yeah, bureaucratic. I mean, absolutely. And I think I think we have to recognize that. But again, change begins with the people. Whilst the organization is slow and bureaucratic, and it always reminds me of my time in India, where there was somebody with, every line there would be somebody else who would fill that line in. But that's okay. We have to start building this in those slow bureaucratic organizations slowly. It doesn't have to be quick, but in other organizations, especially startups and especially in manufacturing and private sector organizations, speed is an essence. Speed will see such a difference because the resistance will be slower. People will go, wow, I want to be part of this. So your talent pool increases as a result of it. If IBM can do it, if the big massive organizations like Alstom and Lloyds Bank can do it, then then I'm sure most organizations, even though they consider themselves as bureaucratic, can do it. But you have to go slow. If you're in an organization in the middle, change is particularly difficult because you're trying to change up, across and down at the same time, and that's particularly difficult. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you stop doing it. All you have to do is to start questioning the what, the why, and the hows in a very careful sense.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Paul. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar now. So any quick concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Only that it's been brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed it, much more than I thought I would, because I was trying to cram almost 12 weeks of lectures into 40 minutes. But I know I've given out lots of information. I know I've probably left a lot of questions out there. But for me, it's the importance of treating people like as you would in a family. That notion of mess, that notion of fun, that notion of, you want to go down to the office, but your children says, park, I want to go on the swings, I want to play football. You'll end up playing football because that's and it's okay. We're not buying time in our organizations any longer. We're buying talent, we're buying passion, we're buying all the soft stuff. And that's really tough for some organizations. But it's okay. It's okay to say to somebody, actually, you don't need to be in at 9 o'clock. 10 o'clock's fine. Just make it up and be good. So trust, absolutely critical. Working with some wonderful people. And if you're not, find an organization or create an organization that you're in that supports it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for taking the time to deliver this live webinar on our platform. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. A lot of you are asking about the recorded version, so please be informed that it will be recorded. It is being recorded and it will be uploaded on webinar.mile.org. So please stay tuned to the website for our all upcoming programs, webinar announcements, and equally to access the recorded version from the archive sections. With that note, I would like to end and conclude. So you all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.